Buen Camino Pilgrims, and welcome back to the Sacred Steps podcast. On this show, we're walking virtually alongside authors and pilgrims, connecting a community of pilgrims from across the globe. I'm your host, Kevin Donahue, pilgrim, backpacker, and author of Sacred Steps, a pilgrimage journal. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to say thank you for your support of the podcast. Since launching in December 2020, we've connected with pilgrims in more than 31 countries. I'm so grateful for your emails and your comments, and for the opportunity to walk virtually alongside you. In an era where we've had to stay apart, it's so fulfilling to be connected with each of you. Thank you for your support of the show and for sharing it with the pilgrim community. On today's episode, we're walking virtually alongside global pilgrim Kevin Considine, recalling his pilgrimages to the 88 Temple Shrine in Japan, his 11 walks across the Camino de Santiago, and his 2020 pilgrimage from Canterbury to Rome and on to Assisi along the Way of St. Francis. Stay tuned after our interview for more information on our next program. And be sure to click subscribe on your podcast app or YouTube so that our episodes download automatically to your phone or device. Kevin Considine, welcome to the Sacred Steps podcast.
Hi, Kevin. Nice to meet you.
Kevin, let me start a little bit because it's easy to get lost in the numbers of your walks and, frankly, your kilometers, which are astounding. But before we go into where you've been and what you've seen, I'd really like to learn a little bit about what called you to pilgrimage.
I was blessed to get some time to walk in Nepal and South America and Europe a little bit. And then when I retired, the following day, this was back in 2013, I flew to Kathmandu and was trekking in the Himalayas. And one evening in a tea house, there were 6 or 7 of us from across the world talking, and the topic of other walks came up, and it was the first time I heard about the Camino de Santiago and the whole idea of starting from anywhere where you wanted, and it being more of a spiritual journey within was very appealing to me because I've done a bunch of meditation in Thailand at Buddhist monasteries, and anyway, it planted a seed, and as time went on, I was drawn more and more to it. And at the end of that trip to Asia, 6 months later in May, I was going to go to, I changed my plans to go to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port to do a Camino de Santiago. But just before I left, my father, his health started to fade, and so I had to postpone the Camino. I flew back to Chicago, but it continued to draw me, even though I was on my way to do other things like Machu Picchu and walk in the Alps. Eventually, I made it for the first time to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port in late July of 2015 to do my first Camino.
And you have become a bit of a noted Camino pilgrim. You have done the Camino more than once now, Kevin.
Well, I call myself the Camino junkie, a Camino junkie. But at this point, I have, 5 years later, and I have, I think it's about a little bit over 400 days and 10,500 kilometers just on the Camino, not counting all the other pilgrimages that I've done.
Each of the routes to Santiago de Compostela has its own highlights, its own spirit, and its own culture in many ways. Do you have a preferred route for the Camino de Santiago?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been there 11 times, and after doing so many Caminos, I was looking for something different, and I was always jealous of my Camino buddies that had walked from their homes in Europe. And being from Chicago, I thought, well, that's something I could never do. And then I'm a little slow, but it finally dawned on me that being Irish American, I could walk from my grandparents' home in the west of Ireland in County Clare. When I was walking all along the way, I was planning to do the Camino del Norte after walking from Ireland, and then I was walking down from Cherbourg through Mont Saint Michel in France, and I was going to walk to Irun and turn right and go to Santiago. And I got to a fork in the road, and something happened. I think I had been listening to my mind the whole time, that I had to do something different. But I got to that fork, and the Camino Frances I've found to be the most special for a lot of different reasons. And I got to that fork and I said, no, this is the most special of all my Caminos, walking all this distance from my ancestral home. And I have to go to the most special of all the Caminos to me, and that was Frances. So I turned left and went to Saint Jean Pied de Port.
Wow. So from Tipperary all the way through the Isles over to France and then the Camino Frances. That's a very special Camino. Must have been a great pilgrim memory for you arriving.
I was supposed to start in Clare, my home county, and by a total coincidence, I got to a little town called Killaloe. And I was going to start there where the East Clare Way starts. And I couldn't find a place to stay. And went into the tourist office finally, and they made a few calls for me. And I told them what I was trying to do, and they apologized to me. They said, we can only find one bed for you in the area, but it's across the river, but it's not in Clare, it's in Tipperary. And I just laughed, and I realized I had the tagline for my blog, it's a long way from Tipperary to Santiago. So, it was all perfect. A wonderful way to start.
We're talking today with global pilgrim Kevin Considine, who has traveled 11 Caminos. He's walked throughout Asia and Europe, and most recently was walking the Via Francigena, and then once you got to Rome, up to Assisi.
Yeah, it's basically 2,000 K from Canterbury to Rome, and we walked about 35 days in France, I think 11 or so in Switzerland, and then I don't know, 40 in Italy. And even after all that walk through England, France, and Switzerland, you're only halfway there. There's still 1,000 K left to walk through in Rome. And I got to Rome, and most people stop and relax and they want to go home. And in this time of COVID, I really didn't want to go back to the States. And after a few days, I said, what the heck? I felt getting into Rome that St. Peter's at the Vatican, isn't that spiritual? It didn't touch me like Santiago did. And anyway, something triggered, and I decided to walk on another 12 days, a few hundred more kilometers northeast back to Assisi, which was wonderful and very, very quiet because Italy was just starting to hit the second wave of COVID, and Umbria, the region where Assisi is, went into an orange. And this time I walked into the Basilica of St. Francis, and there was one other person upstairs. And when I walked down to the tomb, I spent about 10 minutes there alone, other than a single Franciscan monk coming down and helping me with lighting some candles. So it was quite a special experience, and for me, much more spiritual and intimate than Rome.
I've seen a beautiful picture of a walking stick that you set down in Assisi and set aside.
On my walk from Ireland to Santiago, I walked up to the sanctuary at the top of Mount Saint Michel, a very special place off the northern coast of Brittany in North France. And in that sanctuary, I noticed that there was a bin of walking sticks. And there was this huge, ugly stick, bigger than all the others. It had a feather sticking out of the top and a string with the most bizarre shell or skeleton of a square-faced fish. And I just was drawn to it. And I asked the sanctuary keeper, are these sticks available? He said, they're for pilgrims. Take your pick. So I put my bent up commercial walking stick, bent from the bogs in Ireland, and took the big walking stick. And ever since then, I only use natural sticks. The minute I start a pilgrimage, I look and I find a stick, and then I carry it all the way to the end of the pilgrimage and then leave it where I'm at for somebody else. But an hour into the pilgrimage on the West Highland Way, I was walking along, 45 minutes or an hour into the pilgrimage. And again, I don't know what it was, but for some reason I veered off and I walked into the bush, just 5 or 10 meters off the trail. But I didn't see anything. I just had a feeling, and I walked back there and I saw a big old ugly stick. And I said, this isn't particularly a great stick. It wasn't very straight. It had a few knobs sticking out of it. But I said, it'll do for now. And started walking with it. But just one of those things is, I think it's, I don't know, it's like kind of like you're walking with somebody, you grow attached to each other. And the stick became very special, and I walked with it all the way to beyond Rome to Assisi. I left it in Assisi for another pilgrim. I wish I could have taken it with me, but it's there. Hopefully another pilgrim is taking advantage of it.
It's a bit of a metaphor, I think, sometimes for us as pilgrims, as we start to notice that we're a bit more gnarled and knobby as we go, and our warts and all walk with us. I just was so inspired by your story of leaving your stick after each one of your pilgrimages.
2018, I walked the Japan 88 temple, 88 Buddhist temple pilgrimage. But the Japanese people believe that kukai is within your stick, that there's a spirit within the stick. And I've just found there's some truth in that. So
I wonder if you would share with us just a few highlights of how you found the Via Francigena to be different than the Camino de Santiago, given your vast experience with both.
A couple different reasons. I already mentioned the spiritual element of Santiago versus Rome. But on the other hand, spirituality is an intensely personal thing. And, I'm sure there's people that go to Rome and find it much more spiritual than Santiago, but not for me. But I would say that when I walked the Via Francigena way back in the first week or so in France, we walked through a town called Amet, and it's the home of a saint by the name of Saint Benoit. And Saint Benoit walked 30,000 kilometers throughout Europe to all the pilgrimage sites, including Santiago and Rome. He died in the streets of Rome, basically a beggar, but he would always share with others, and he was loved by the children, loved by the beggars, and others, everybody in Rome. And his tomb is in a very small, nondescript church, not too far from the Colosseum. I walked on to that church and to that tomb, and it was very spiritual and intensely emotional for me when I visited his tomb all alone in that nondescript church. So that's one reason, one difference. But the other difference is that you walk through 4 countries. A couple days in England, we walked 30 days or so, 35 days, I think, in France, 12 or so in Switzerland, and then another 40 plus in Italy. And so there's all those variations of cultures, languages, foods, which I really liked. I found that very appealing. And then one other thing, very different from the Camino Frances and even some of the other Caminos, was the Via Francigena could be quite lonely. Walking through France, I ran into, gosh, maybe 4 or 5 other pilgrims, if that many. Local people have kind of come together, and many of them offer up their homes to pilgrims if there's no albergue of any sort, or gîte around, as they call them in France. So, and I found it just so special to walk into a town and have somebody that wants to be of service to the pilgrims. They welcome you in, they give you a bed, a dinner, a shower. A lot of times they'll wash your clothes for you. And that was just absolutely beautiful, especially if you walked the whole day, you didn't see anybody, you were tired, and then to have these kind people welcome you into their homes and treat you like royalty was very special.
We're talking with global pilgrim Kevin Considine on the Sacred Steps podcast. Kevin has shared many photos from his Via Francigena walk this year in 2020, as well as some good advice for pilgrims who are considering this pilgrimage versus the Camino de Santiago. Please see the show notes below, where we'll link both those photos as well as Kevin's advice for walking these pilgrimages. Kevin, you've walked a bit every year. You've been around the world. I'm interested to know, will you be walking in 2021?
I imagine I will be, but I suspect that has a lot to do with COVID. But I'm very hopeful. It worked out in 2020 for me, and I was able to do some wonderful pilgrimages. So I'm optimistic that the same thing will happen in 2001, but time will tell.
Kevin, let me ask you, for pilgrims who have done the Camino de Santiago and are looking for maybe a different pilgrimage experience, given that frame of reference for someone who's walked only the Camino de Santiago, where would you recommend they go next?
I think people should just explore. If they like the coastal walks, I don't think that Del Norte can be beat. If they want solitude and a longer walk, the Via de la Plata, right through the heart of Spain, and through Roman history on an old silver road, is quite special at 1,000 kilometers. And the Chemin de Puy, if you like France, is wonderful. And what's kind of nice about that is, if you want to do a longer pilgrimage, and I did this once, if you start in Le Puy-en-Velay, you can walk 750K through France, enjoy the French culture and food, and it's not so crowded, but it still has all the infrastructure that the Camino de Santiago's do. And after 750 kilometers, you're in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and you don't have to go home if you don't want to. If you have the time, you can walk on to Santiago and Muxia, which makes a wonderful 1,700K or more trek.
I think you've begun working on your own book for the Camino de Santiago. Can you give us a little insight?
Yeah, well, if you listen to this, you won't be surprised by the title. It's called, and I don't know if this will be the final title, but Camino Junkie, It's a Long Way from Tipperary to Santiago. And in it, I walk from my ancestral home, as I mentioned, to Santiago and Finisterre, Muxia. And while I'm walking, I also recollect and bring back different memories that I have of all the different caminos that I've done and all the different pilgrimages. For example, the 88 temple pilgrimage in Japan and a little bit of the Via Francigena. So,
our guest today has been Kevin Considine, global pilgrim, Camino junkie, and future published author on the Camino de Santiago. Kevin, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your stories. I appreciate it so very much.
Thank you, Kevin. I enjoy talking about it. Camino junkies love nothing more than to talk about the Camino, so thank you.
Be well and stay safe. We look to follow you on your journeys. I'll link them in the show notes below. Thank you so much, Kevin. Buen Camino.
Buen Camino.
Our next episode, we're talking to Camino pilgrim and author Claude Tranchant. Her new book, Boots to Freedom, is the follow-up to her bestseller, Boots to Bliss, detailing her Camino pilgrimage, which began at age 64 and continues now more than a decade later, with walks through Nepal, Central Australia, and once more on the Camino de Santiago. Please click subscribe so that our next episode downloads automatically to your device. Thank you for subscribing to the Sacred Steps podcast. Until next time, be well, stay safe, and buen camino.